So my name is Meik Wiking, and I'm the CEO of the Happiness Research Institute. And our work is essentially trying to answer three questions. How do we measure well-being? Why are some people happier than others? And how do we improve quality of life? And it's the same basic questions we've been trying to answer together with Leo Innovation Lab, but we are focusing on people living with psoriasis. And we want to focus on happiness because we think that is the most important thing for people. We also see increasingly governments and political institutions focusing on happiness. We see the UN passing a resolution on happiness. We see the UN publishing the World Happiness Report. We see different governments now also measuring well-being and quality of life, and not just GDP and standard of living. And we see organizations like the OECD also incorporating well-being in the way they measure progress for their membership countries. And basically, we've been asking these questions. How happy are you? How is life? How high is your quality of life? And by now, we have almost 1,400 people from more than 50 countries around the world, where we've collected data on how it is to live with psoriasis. And I'm going to present a lot of numbers, I'm going to present a lot of data, but I think it's important that we remember behind every piece of data there is a person. So I'm just going to read out one of the testimonies we got from one of our respondents. I feel hideous and unattractive. I don't want to leave the house in the morning. I feel like everyone is secretly repulsed by me. I worry that the psoriasis will never go away. I feel hopeless every time it gets worse. Now we know that this statement was from a young woman in the UK. In the survey, she is referred to as respondent 237, but we've chosen to name her Julia because we want us and people reading it to remember there is a person behind every statistic that we present here today. So when we look at the data collected globally, we find that living with psoriasis has a strong negative impact on our happiness, on our well-being, and on our quality of life. In fact, we find in Denmark, the UK, and the US, people living with psoriasis are between 12 and 24% less happy than the average population in those three countries. Now, perhaps it's unsurprising that people living with psoriasis are less happy, but I think it's really interesting to see that happiness gap varies where we measure it. The happiness inequality varies where we look. And just to give you some examples, first we have Denmark, usually one of the happiest countries in the world. If we take the World Happiness Report and use that metric and that scale, happiness in Denmark has an average of 7.5 on a scale from 0 to 10. That's usually the highest level we see in the world. Now, people living with psoriasis in Denmark, so within the same country with the same understanding of what happiness is, report an average of 6.6. So a gap of 0.9. They are 12% less happy than the average Dane. Now, when we look at the US and the UK, what we find here is the gap is even bigger. People living with psoriasis in the US are 20% less happy than the average American, and people living with psoriasis in the United Kingdom are 24% less happy than average people in the UK. Now, how much is a 1.6 gap? To a lot of people, doesn't, they don't have a sort of sense of comparison. So just to give you some perspective on this, let me show you that if we look at a 1-point gap, if we take those three same countries, it would mean that there is the same gap between Denmark and Uruguay, or UK and Turkmenistan, or US and Venezuela. So living with psoriasis in the US means like living or having the same quality of life as people experience in Venezuela. That's the gap we're talking about. And to give you another perspective on it, if we take the happiest country in the world and look at the least happy countries, and these are unsurprisingly countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Burundi, we see happiness gaps of 4.6, so 3 times higher than the gap we saw in the UK. So that is actually overwhelmingly high. And imagine or consider how many things goes into defining our happiness levels. Of course, under which government regime we live under, of course our health status, but also our income, our employment status, our relationship with other people, our age, our gender. A lot of things define how happy we are. And here we have one factor that can impact us up to 24%. That is quite considerably. Now all these are numbers. And of course it's also important to remember, how do people describe living with psoriasis? And we've asked people in our study exactly that. And when we ask them what kind of words would you use to describe living with psoriasis, they mention words like shameful, painful, lonely, embarrassing, and some even use the word hell. And I think that's why we need to raise awareness and understanding of how it is to be living with psoriasis. Because only 20% of people living with psoriasis feel that their healthcare professionals take their psoriasis seriously enough. Only 27% feels that their closest family fully understand what it is for them to be living with psoriasis. And 41% feel like they are the only one in the world living with psoriasis. In the UK, there's almost 2 million. In the US, we have 7 million. So why do 41% feel they are the only one? That's why we need to raise our voices and we need to be heard. It's just in the words of John, who's 38 from Canada, I've given up the idea of a support network. People can't deal with chronic illness. I've lost friends and family members to them thinking I'm just lazy or scamming the system or making too big a deal out of nothing. And this is why we need to raise awareness of how it is to be living with psoriasis. And we need even more people in our survey. We need more data on understanding how it is to be living with this disease, and also to understand what are the gaps in different countries between people living with and without psoriasis. Thank you.